Hoorah! What was your inspiration? That was the question Octavius was just asked by the interviewer. But it was a question he was surprisingly unprepared for. While internally panicking as he tried to come up with a good answer in a timely manner, there was also a pretty strong sense of stupidity lurking in his thinking space. Honestly, that should have been the first question to be prepared for when heading into a TV interview for his newly published novel. But this was the first time he had ever been on TV, the first time he had ever been interviewed, the first time anyone has actually been interested in what he had to say. And after all the years of wishing for people to take him seriously, right now all he wished for was to be a member sitting in the studio audience. What was his inspiration? If he went back in time 1 year ago and told his then self that he'd be fired from his job, randomly write a horror novel about a man being trapped in a shopping mall, have that novel become a bestseller, and then be invited to a daytime TV show for an interview, he'd probably give himself a proper punch in the face. Partly because, knowing his personal habit of having an aggressive reaction towards things that frighten him, he'd get freaked out at the sight of seeing himself. But also because, at the time, he was just so angry and so stuck that the thought of something amazing happening to him like this would have felt like an insult. Growing up, Octo, as everyone usually referred to him as, never really had much aspiration for what he wanted to achieve in his life. And he was fine with it. He didn't mind if he didn't change the world. He just wanted to live in it, explore it. It seemed huge and vast, full of infinite possibilities. And he wasn't about to tie himself down to one road. But it seemed that wasn't his decision to make. Life had a way of choosing one's road for them, and it was the one holding the rope. Octo only really started to feel it near the end of high school, the feeling of something shrinking around him. Every year got shorter, and with it, the world got a little smaller. But it was easy to ignore. Too easy. His mind slowly got preoccupied with, of course, things. Of course he had to get an education. Of course he had to get a job. Of course he had responsibilities. They weren't things to complain about. It was just a part of life. They were just things that he, of course, needed to do. But still, the shrinking of the world didn't stop, and the rate of its shrinking kept getting faster and faster as he grew older, and it was scary, very scary, terrifying even. But at the time, Octo didn't even fully realize this himself, possibly due to his being scared equals be aggressive habit, but all he knew was that he was pissed. He had so much anger and hate towards everything, and he didn't know why, or rather, he didn't care why. As Octo was all too familiar with, hate has a way of filling a person with the worst kind of comfort. The kind that tells you what's what, makes you think you're thinking clearly, when in reality it just eats you up and tears you apart. Maybe hate was his inspiration, Octavius thought as he glanced at his watch. Only about 30 seconds had gone by since the interviewer had asked the question. His mind had quite a fast thinking speed when it was panicking. But was he really going to tell the world that the reason he wrote his novel was because of hate? It just sounded so edgy. And still, something felt wrong about the answer anyway. Sure, he had a lot of hate when he started writing it, and sure, he released a lot of it into his novel. But no, there had to have been more. Octavius gave the interviewer a complimentary rebuttal of, my inspiration, huh? That's an interesting story, and then reached for his mug. Perhaps a long drink of water would be enough stalling time to figure this out. Now where did his racing mind leave off? Oh yes, hate and fear. Lovely. It was now clear to him that underneath all that hate and anger was just fear. Fear of being stuck in the same humdrum routine for the rest of his life. And that with every year, the sure thought in his head that he would get opportunities to explore and enrich his life lessened. He questioned that sure thought, and slowly turned it around into a sure thought that he was going to be trapped in his store clerk job at the mall forever. Hey, that was his inspiration for having the story set inside a mall. But no, wait, that was just a detail. He needed more. He needed to get deeper. The core inspiration for the story. Back to sipping that water. So there Octo was, stuck in his non-moving life, with anger, hate, and fear for it growing with every year. And into the mix comes confusion. Why was his life this way? What did he do? Or rather, what did everyone else do to him? Yes, it was all too easy to turn that hate and confusion towards others. Everything that was wrong, every little thing that annoyed him had someone to blame. From his boss, to his school, to his parents, to the customer that made him have to stay past his shift that time because the man couldn't pick between the black or brown shoes. Octo was just plain bitter. And as he thought back on who he was at the time, Octavius almost couldn't believe that was him. He had built such a fragile house of cards inside him made from his problems. It was going to have to go at some point. And being fired just about did it. Well, he was actually laid off, but either way, Octo went from a bitter man to an unemployed bitter man. The house of cards came crumbling down, and his world felt like shrink wrap closed around him. He didn't have any more room inside him for more anger and blame. Instead, all that disappeared, and all that was left was one question, replaying in his head over and over. What was the point? What was the point in being angry if nothing changed? What was the point in working hard if it got him nowhere? What was the point in dreaming about bigger things when he barely had enough time in the day to fulfill the of course tasks? And what was the point in fulfilling the of course if even that would reject him? What was the point? He could have easily found a new job, but he wasn't up for it. As a matter of fact, he wasn't up for much. He started waking up later and hardly stepped out of his apartment, unless it was to fulfill an absolutely necessary of course task. During one of these few treks from his house, Octo was walking to his car with groceries when he overheard some commotion going on in the park next to the supermarket. Out of curiosity, he went over and discovered an old man with a large, oddly shaped case running around trying to sell it to people in the park. As Octo continued to watch, he found out that this man was in desperate need for cash, and to fix this problem, he was offering to sell, for cheap, none other than a typewriter. Octo didn't fully understand why this man wouldn't just put it up for sale online, but the very fact that this old guy possessed a typewriter probably answered the question. To no surprise to Octo, the old man was freaking out everyone in the park. Trying to sell people stuff on the street is never taken well, and it certainly didn't help things that this guy hadn't combed his hair and was missing his left shoe. To this day, Octavius is not sure why in the world he did what he did next. Perhaps it was because he pitied the old man. Perhaps he was just trying to prevent anyone from calling the cops on him, as Octo was sure they would if he waited much longer. Perhaps it was just because Octo was in desperate need for something new and exciting to happen. Or maybe it was just because typewriters were cool. But either way, Octo walked right up to the old crazy guy, pulled out his wallet, and said, "I'll take it." And after many thank yous and a very vigorous handshake, the old man bounced away, leaving Octo with an old, heavy, questionably originated typewriter. When Octo went home that day, he set up the mechanical beast and held his breath as he pushed down the first letter. Octavius was just glad no one was around to see him at the time, because the satisfaction he got from the clickiness of the typewriter made him way too happy for a grown man. And so, a big part of Octavius becoming an author was, as embarrassing as it was, the fun that he had with using that typewriter. He simply loved pushing the buttons, but he didn't want the activity to go to waste, so he quickly came up with a rough idea for a story and clicked away. However, this story would soon grow into so much more than just an excuse for his trigger-happy fingers. As he wrote, Octo started getting attached to his protagonist. He started getting more curious about the world he had created. And as he watched his character, who was scared for his life as he tried desperately to find a way out of the possessed mall, he became invested into the story. He needed to find out what would happen. He needed to see how his character would make it out. And so for the next 3 weeks, Octo spent hours upon hours sitting at his typewriter, clicking away at the buttons. Even though he was sitting in his apartment, it felt like he was right there with his protagonist, feeling what he felt, the confusion, the fear, the anger, until the day when his character finally burst through the doors and took a breath of fresh air. And with it, so did Octo. Except, of course, the stuffy air in his apartment wasn't nearly as fresh as the air his protagonist was tasting, especially considering he had neglected his laundry bin for some time. But it felt like the first breath of air Octo had taken in years. And when he stood up from his desk, he felt lighter. He looked out his window, and it seemed huge, vast, beautiful. The shrink-wrapped feeling was gone. He felt like he had so much work to do now, but he was ready to dive into it. Writing became Octo's accidental therapy, and his character his accidental therapist. He had all the answers, and as his character fought through the physical hell he had to go through, Octo fought through his internal hell, and together they found a way out. A light bulb lit up in Octavius. He now realized what his inspiration was. It wasn't something seen on the surface, but it was what held everything together. It was what got the protagonist through the horror. It was what made him keep going even though he was an absolute chicken at heart. It was the thought that there was a way. That if there could be such horror, then there could be miracles. Things could and would get better. It was the same thing that was inside Octo. The same thing that kept him getting out of bed every day, even when he didn't want to. The thing that he always had with him, no matter how much he convinced himself it was gone. Octavius lowered his mug of water and took a mighty swallow. It was one hell of a sip of water. He smacked his lips and looked at his watch. He had been taking a drink for a good minute, but he was finally ready. He looked the patient interviewer in the eyes and said, "There were a lot of things that inspired this story, but at the core, all of it can really be summed up into one word: hope." Yeah. Hello, I'm Zaccura, and thank you for listening to my story of October. If you're new here, then this is part 10 in a currently ongoing series on my channel that I'm doing for the year of 2018, where every month I attempt to create a character based off of that month, as well as write a story for them. So you just listen to October's story, and I'll have the playlist which has the rest of the stories linked up in the card as well as in the description box. So if you'd like to check them out, you can. Also, all the stories are standalone, so you don't have to listen to them in any particular order. But for now, it's time to move on to the chatty bit for this month's video. So like you guys know, every month there's always a word or phrase meaning that is attached to the month, and the word for October was hope. There you go. That explains a lot, doesn't it? So when I first was brainstorming ideas for October's story, for one, well, it's October, the spookiest month of them all, right? So I wanted to add some kind of element of scariness or horror into the story, but then I saw hope as the meaning for the month and was like, well now, how is that gonna work? I took myself away from writing a scary story and instead looked at what is the basis of a horror story and how could I in some way turn that into something hopeful. And when I thought about it, I actually realized that when you really think about it, horror stories are actually the most hopeful stories out there in a way. Or at least ones that end good. If it's a horror and a tragedy story, then whew, that just sucks, bro. But the whole point of most horror stories is how can we escape the horror? How can we get through this? How can we get all this bad stuff to end? And I think that if you were any protagonist in most any horror story, you'd have to be pretty darn hopeful. I mean, you are literally trudging through stuff. So the only thing that could possibly get you to keep going and survive would be hope. And fear, but fear only gets you so far. You gotta be hopeful. A hope that at the other side of the stuff is something better. And since I was now looking at horror stories from the outside, I guess I figured, heck, let's make the story about a guy who makes a horror story. Storyception. So yeah, I guess I pulled the author card, just like I pulled the artist card for May's story. She was an artist, Octavius is an author, so now we have a character who's an artist and a character who's an author. Yay! When it actually came to writing the character of Octavius, I wanted his life to almost sort of play off of the horror story he was writing, as a way of showing how horrifying just a normal, everyday person's life can be to them. Whew, that's pretty deep sounding. Yeah, this is like, if you've ever met a writer and saw them just staring into nothingness for like hours, this is the kind of deepness that's going through their head. That, or they're just completely procrastinating and thinking about why they hadn't eaten lunch yet. I tend to do that a lot. But going back to Octavius, that was indeed my thinking of showing the contrast of literal horror and internal horror. I definitely had fun with the slight humor aspect in this story, I was having a bit of fun with Octavius's character, and honestly, I probably would have done the same thing if I had a typewriter. I mean, come on, you can't tell me those things don't look fun. Overall, I'm pretty okay with the story. Not necessarily my favorite so far, but I do like it. As for the illustration, on the other hand, I think I've gotten so used to drawing super tiny because of Inktober that I totally didn't realize that I drew him too small. Like, he's quite far away from the camera, if you will, and all the other month's illustrations have the characters much closer and thus bigger. So yeah, that happened. He's tiny. But not proportionately tiny. He's just really far away. The birthstone for the month was Opal. And if I thought drawing Diamond for April was going to be anxiety-inducing, Opal was on another level, people. Opal is sort of the tutti frutti of gemstones. It comes in lots and lots of different colors, and it has a lot of these little flecks of different, like, iridescent colors. And I had no clue where to even start when I looked up those photos, people. I chose to draw white opal, which is a sort of white milky variety of the stone, which has all those varied colored flecks in it. And I chose to use my Winsor & Newton inks to color that rather than my watercolors because of the way the inks tend to mix and dry. I felt the inks always have this cool blockiness with the colors. They don't just all mix together into one thing like watercolors. So I figured that would make the flecks of color look better. And overall, I'm actually very surprised at how well it turned out. It definitely isn't perfect, but it's close enough, I think. The flowers for the month were marigolds, cosmos, and calendulas. Sounds like a vampire name. Calendula. The colors for the month were white, yellow, and varied, probably because of the opal. And since cosmos come in all sorts of colors, I had planned on using that to add other colors, like that was the plan in my head. But after I inked the flowers, I realized I only put 2 cosmos in there, and like one sorry looking closed one, I guess. And the rest were just marigolds and calendulas. So there was lots of yellow and orange and not a whole lot of other stuff, but it's fine. I ended up making the aura around everything multicolored this time around, so there you go. And the zodiac signs for the month are Libra and Scorpio. As for the name, it's pretty obvious this month. Octavious, October, you get it. Couldn't really think of anything else other than the other variations of Octavius, like Octavian and whatever. It was a bit old Roman sounding, naturally, but actually I figured it would be a cool name for a horror author. I mean, I'd buy a book if it was written by an Octavius. So it works out, I guess. I don't know, y'all gonna have to let me know what you think. And that's pretty much it for this month's monthly character video. I have been so busy with Inktober that it was hard to get done, but here it is. And there's only a couple days left in Inktober. The last week's video, which has like the week 4's drawings for Inktober, should be coming soon, as well as the walkthrough vid. But for now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments, how did you like the story and the illustration this month? And are you a fan of horror? Do you like horror stories and movies and stuff like that? I'd say I'm actually personally not a big fan. Mostly because I feel like so much of the movies nowadays are just jump scare movies. Like, all horror movies now are just jump scare movies, and like, I'm not a big fan of jump scare movies. I like when things have story, like, you know, they're not just flat out gross and terrifying with no reason or no story or deepness whatsoever. But that's just me. If you like jump scare, like, that's totally cool. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on upcoming videos. I make new videos every week, so be sure to hit the little bell to stay notified for when I upload. If you'd like to follow me on social media, all the links to that are in the description box where you can follow me for daily updates. And until next time, stay awesome, stay inspired, always. See ya!